G'day everyone, welcome back to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. Really great to have you back and join me on this journey that we're going on to unpick the roots and the dynamics of the war in Ukraine. And you'll remember last time we covered the history of the cultural, political background to how we get this construct of a Ukrainian state and a Russian state that can be at loggerheads through history, but also now obviously breaking out into this war that's plagued us. And we finished last time where we saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the creation of the new state of Ukraine and some of the issues and problems they faced early on in separating from Russia. And there was some goodwill on both sides during the early parts of that process. But then what we're going to introduce and unpack this week is the dynamic around President Vladimir Putin, which is not only the key catalytic element of this situation, of this war, but also more broadly to understand Putin is to understand a lot of the dynamics and of the problems of the world at the moment and how it interconnects and interplays, particularly with other autocrats and dictators. And let's be very clear, Vladimir Putin is now a dictator. But how did that happen? Okay, so it's very important to understand the background of Vladimir Putin. He grew up in St Petersburg, or Leningrad it was then called, and his parents had survived and earlier generations had survived the impact of the German invasion of Russia, particularly the horrendous siege of Leningrad, in which hundreds of thousands of residents died through famine and the shelling and attacks by the Germans on the city, which was completely surrounded and under siege at one point. And his father was quite a hero of that conflict and was a very, very stern adherent to communism, believed in communism and the Soviet Union. And so obviously in his early years as a child, was, raised on the concept of this greater Soviet empire and the importance of the Soviet Union and the style of central governments, etc. And as he grew up, he then started looking at ways of being part of the communist system through, the Young Red Guards and all these things. But eventually, he then became a member of the KGB, and people will remember the KGB was the most active, serious international and domestic intelligence organization of the Soviet Union, and was engaged in conducting a lot of the international espionage, but also a lot of the more pointy activities that the Soviet Union used to conduct in those days of targeted assassinations and kidnappings and etc. But also more broadly, internationally, carrying forward the Soviet mission and how interference in other international states would occur to try and shape politics in the favour of the Soviet Union. So you have Vladimir Putin in his days of training and then performing as an officer of the KGB, really being brought up on all of these tactics of skullduggery and assassination, etc. So not really a great preparation for a leader of a democratic state. And he did actually finish as a colonel in the KGB. He spent a lot of his time posted to East Germany at that time. Importantly, he was in East Germany as a KGB colonel at the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And he watched the dynamic of the disintegration of the Soviet Empire during that process and was deeply challenged and confronted by that because he had a firm belief in the Soviet Union as an empire and its territorial controls and its power in the world. This was someone who was particularly really wedded to the concept of power. He was really infatuated with that idea of power and the types of personal power you could organise and exercise within that kind of structure, and something he enjoyed doing himself in having the freedom and latitude in that really intense Cold War period of contest at the front line of that between West Germany and East Germany. So he watched all of that disintegration with a great deal of concern. But of course, it left him effectively without a job in the early days. The KGB was eventually disbanded, transformed in one sense, and moved into different types of construct. Later on, we would see that evolved into the FSB, the GRU, the SVR. So you had different intelligence services for the military, for foreign affairs, and for domestic purposes. And so, the long process of trying to bring that construct into a democratic framework. So Putin, at a loose end, eventually decides to enter politics in the early 1990s, and he quickly rose through the ranks in politics and became the deputy mayor of St Petersburg, basically applying some of the tactics, techniques, procedures he'd learned in the KGB within the confines at that point in time of just manipulating the democratic process rather than some of the sharper end stuff that he used to be involved in. And so in particular, he served as deputy mayor under the mayor of St Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak, between 1994 and 1996. And so he became kind of like the right-hand man for Sobchak in some of the political maneuverings and tactics that used to go on during that time in the early days, a bit Wild West stuff, issues that Russia was trying to deal with in transitioning to democracy. Not a lot of people had any experience of that. Russia, throughout its entire history, up until 1990, had no experience of democracy. There'd been a couple of mechanisms that operated from time to time, like the Duma under the later Russian Tsars, but those were simply rubber stamp enterprises that really had nothing to do with true governance of the state or control of it. Under an autocratic Tsar, moving forward into an autocratic General Secretary of the Communist Party, and then this period of feeling out into democracy. So, effectively, during that period, he learned a lot about the dynamics of how you might be able to work with the democratic process for personal gain or advancement. And then he moved on from that experience to join the administration of President Boris Yeltsin, who was one of the early attempts to come up with a democratic leader committed to moving towards a rapprochement, engagement, entente with the West, and building a free economy, a free market within Russia, and really liberating the political constraints on the Russian people. And Boris Yeltsin did make some serious attempts to do that within his capabilities, which were at times very limited because people will remember perhaps that he was a bit of an interesting character who liked a bit of a go at the old bottles of vodka, and there were some famous, interesting incidents associated with that. But Yeltsin really came to trust Vladimir Putin and supported him, and Yeltsin depended on him to a very large degree too, in terms of what Putin could bring to the table as an organizer, as a person who was able to help manipulate the Russian scene and support for Yeltsin's presidency. And so eventually, 1999, Yeltsin appointed Vladimir Putin as prime minister. And later that year, of course, Yeltsin actually resigned. He was having health issues and was no longer really up to the job. And so he made Putin the acting president of Russia at that point. And so Putin then is put in a very good position to actually contest the presidential election of the year 2000, slightly after that, handing over of the crown effectively to Vladimir Putin from Yeltsin. So he applied everything that he learned in the dynamics of the state of Russian democracy as it was then, building an understanding of communication strategies at this time too, and was able to win the presidential election of the year 2000 in a legitimate manner. So there was no ballot stuffing, none of that kind of thing really going on. No persecution of political opponents or killing of them. So his persona, as he portrayed it to the Russian people, was very attractive to them. A strong man who was still intent on liberating Russia and creating a free market economy, but was going to be tough on things that mattered to Russians in terms of asserting Russia in the world, asserting and preserving Russian power, and being harsh on crime and on terrorism, etc. So the entire time that he then served as president from 2000 onwards was really this steady process of effectively like the death of 1,000 cuts of undermining Russian democracy, centralizing power, focusing on strengthening the Russian state as part of his strength and his power, and returning Russia to its status as an empire effectively, and returning to the old days that he pined for of the Soviet Union, but also hearkening back to the heroes of empire building in Peter the Great particularly, and Catherine the Great. Not so much signals to Catherine the Great because she was a woman after all, so Peter the Great is one he often references. So all of that too over time was a process of dismantling the growth of democracy, the nascent democratic processes, choking it off in the cradle before it could really grow in a country where, as I say, there had been no traditional history of it. So eventually what you saw in that process was the gradual, steady suppression of political opposition, control over the media now. These days, a complete stranglehold of the media. There is no free and independent media in Russia. And then applying the use of all of the state's resources to maintaining himself in power. And people might remember that there was actually a constitutional requirement that a Russian president couldn't serve more than a couple of terms, similar to the United States. So the way Putin got around that in the first instance was to hand off the presidency to Medvedev, his deputy, and then who was prime minister at the time. And then he stepped down to become prime minister. And then after Medvedev's term was completed, he then swapped back over to become the president of Russia again, and then eliminated those constitutional impediments from that point on. And he has remained the president of Russia ever since, and will be there for life, unless events intervene before he gets to reach the end of his life as president. So in that time too, you start to see a lot of KGB techniques that have been externally applied to internal opponents, assassinations, murders, the deployment of more sophisticated tools like the Novichok chemical poisonings that occurred in relation to Sergei and Yulia Skripal, and of course the murder of Alexei Navalny, who was the key focal point for opposition to Putin in more recent times, who died in captivity and imprisonment in Russia, having returned there from his relative safety abroad after a previous failed attempt to assassinate him while he was on an aeroplane with this chemical poisoning. You had the example, too, of Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned by polonium-210, which is a uranium-based contaminant that killed Litvinenko. So this became standard practice, and then other techniques globally and in Russia were deployed of a more, brutal and open manner, such as a bit of a rash or an epidemic of people falling out of windows seemed to be a common theme at one point, and became, I think, quite a point of mirth for Vladimir Putin. People were meeting their ends in this repetitive manner, falling out of windows. But particular examples of how he applied this, not only to political opponents, but also to his control of the media. One of the very courageous Russian journalists, Anna Politkovskaya, was a prominent journalist known for her critical reporting on the way Russia conducted the Chechen conflict and human rights abuses there. She was assassinated in 2006 and was definitely politically motivated. Boris Nemtsov, who was a politician but a vocal critic of Putin's and contributed to various media outlets. He was assassinated in 2015 near the Kremlin. And Natalia Estemarova was a human rights activist and journalist who reported on abuses in Chechnya as well. She was abducted and murdered in 2009. So this has become standard operating procedure for Putin within Russia, but it was soon to be applied elsewhere. Now, the arms of power that Putin created as he progressed through this autocratizing of Russia, in fact returning it to its autocratic roots, was partly to team up with the Russian mafia And particular figures of the Russian mafia, or the Bratva, as they call themselves, this little brotherhood, is a person like Semyon Mogilyevich, who's been very active internationally with the Russian mafia. They've managed to glean billions of dollars through their empire, and they also have been connected to other East European organised crime groups, in particular in Kosovo and Moldova. And Putin's regime has actually used elements of organised crime in Kosovo and Moldova to help them with their volumizing of things like their social media information warfare efforts, etc. The Atlantic Council, in fact, has said that Russian mafia have about $1 trillion worth of wealth at their disposal that they've generated, and it's called, dark money that's hidden abroad from Russia. But they expand a lot of their operations to the countries in which they've based themselves internationally as well. And there are reports too, one of the means by which they do this, which served Putin's political objectives in supporting, for example, Donald Trump in the lead up to the 2016 elections. Donald Trump was heavily in debt and going bankrupt in many of his efforts at the time. And so the Russian mafia came to his rescue by using holding companies to purchase properties in all of his international network of Trump towers. So this was a crossover between the organised crime money laundering objective and the political objectives of Vladimir Putin. So they give Vladimir Putin a financial resource at arm's length and the ability to do things, assassinations and other activities that he can deny were acts of Russia or him. So the Russian mafia has been a particularly important part of his power internationally and at home. Another element of that has been the evolution of the oligarchs in Russia. What we've seen there is that immediately after the end of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Russian economy had to somehow find a way to transition to a free market. And a lot of academics came in with all sorts of advice saying, you'd need a short, sharp shock. Let's just create a transition of these state-owned enterprises by issuing shares and, creating immediate transition. And a lot of very smart and well-connected entrepreneurs who operated during that Yeltsin period of 91 to 99 emerged exploiting that process ruthlessly. It started from nearly nothing, became rich through participation in the artificial market that was created at that time to try and facilitate that transition. One has to remember that during that period, there was none of the regulatory frameworks that have evolved in Western democracies: securities regulation, environmental regulation, labour laws, consumer laws, and market control, monopolies, and trust regimes, antitrust regimes. The sorts of legislation we've seen in Australia that focuses on promoting fair competition, all of these things, none of that structure existed in Russia, so it was very open to exploitation. So that enabled these people to come in and really steal the march, take control, become monopolized oligarchs of great wealth, exploiting existing state-operated enterprises. That's voucher privatisation program from 92 to 94 just really played into that process. And so that's where you get the difference between old domestic prices for Russian commodities such as natural gas and oil and the prices that were prevailing on the world market, created through this voucher regime, were then exploited through the arbitrage process that happened at the time where the great wealth was generated. So that was the first wave of oligarchs, and Putin was well aware of this, and he thought he could win points domestically in Russia by showing his confrontation of these oligarchs and bringing them to heel. He made several sort of showpiece media events associated with that, and his intent was to actually change out those oligarchs for people that were sycophants and servants of his interests, and the mutual self-interest that could be applied to that great wealth for individuals, provided you towed the line and met his needs, and then again would give him another arm of power as well through the great wealth that these oligarchs wielded. So a second wave of these oligarchs then started emerging from the 2000s. who were all friends and former colleagues of Putin from his St Petersburg municipal administration or his KGB days. So effectively, a complete regime change of the oligarchy, but the maintaining of that oligarch framework, which completely perverts the Russian economy and has been used to pervert its politics and international affairs. So this is what the Russian billionaires, the oligarchs, look like these days and the sorts of wealth that's at their disposal. So you can see these are great sums of money, billions of dollars of personal wealth, and they then they manifest themselves in those massive super yachts that you've seen. And when the war with Ukraine broke out, you saw a concerted effort to maybe put pressure on Putin through these oligarchs by seizing those massive super yachts that were at the disposal of these oligarchs. So then Putin, of course, turns his attention to restoring the empire, and his broader geopolitical outlook was to restore Russian prestige, his prestige, interfere in political activity, military activity was associated also with that in several neighbouring states, which sort of sailed under the international concern for a time because they were former Soviet republics. It included activities in Chechnya, activities in Georgia, Estonia, Azerbaijan, etc. So this was the growth of his international outreach when he was consolidated in his power in Russia. So during the war, during the 2008 war, where Russian forces were engaged in Georgia, you saw a lot of these things combining in the political interference and the military effort, and alarm bells should have been ringing back then. So, and it was done through creating and then, in theory, backing separatist regions within the state and looking like you were backing nationalist or local elements of a society, but it wasn't a Russian-imposed thing. So this is one of the means by which he creates these conditions for some sort of plausible deniability of it being a Russian affair. So, we've seen all of this continuing and grow various forms. They practice their techniques and procedures in various countries, but interference in Moldova ongoing and the Baltic states. And then these activities became supplemented by cyber warfare as well as information warfare. And that came to be really tested in relation to Ukraine. So Ukraine really was at the heart of Putin's intent and emotional connection with really aiming to destroy the independence that state had created, believing that it was a central piece of the Russian Empire and particularly the natural and other resources that were part of Ukraine, and particularly concerned about its leanings towards the West and the potential of Ukraine even joining NATO. So he was fully intent on preventing that from happening. So started interfering in Ukrainian elections and politics very persistently right throughout his time, and even today, continuing to try and do that and continuing to use other actors to try and interfere in Ukraine politics, such as President Trump and the comments that he's made about the sufferings of the Ukrainian people being related to the obstinacy of their leaders, etc. So, he attempted to promote disorder as well in that political landscape. In the 2004 presidential elections in Ukraine, he also resorted to poisoning Viktor Yushchenko. You might remember the pictures of Yushchenko's face as a result of that poisoning really disfigured him. A manipulation of the election at the time to secure the victory of Viktor Yanukovych, who was a Putin puppet. And then the reaction to that through the so-called Orange Revolution, whereby the results were clearly had been changed and they were annulled by the Ukrainian Supreme Court, exercising some independence. And it highlighted the widespread fraud and corruption that was the reasons why that had to be annulled, and a rerun saw Yushchenko actually win that election. Then the beginnings of Ukraine in response to all this interference and intervention, wanting to join NATO and the EU in 2008, and including in that process was an effort by Georgia to do so as well. And then, of course, Russia invaded Georgia, as I mentioned, and circumvented that. And the weak international response that followed kind of encouraged Putin that he could continue to operate like this without any repercussions. So Putin continued to weaken Ukrainian processes and try and undermine the state and his information warfare. And it did result actually in Yanukovych winning the 2010 election. And so Putin looking to use then that puppet to further manipulate and destroy Ukrainian independence. But you still saw the Ukrainian parliament wanting to progress this free trade progress and entering agreement with the EU. So Putin obviously knew that things had to be ramped up here, and so he tried to prevent, with embargoes, Ukrainian goods free flow of the economic activity between Ukraine and Russia, and put economic pressure on them, and warning that he might not respect the borders of Ukraine if that agreement was pursued. And so Yanukovych, being the puppet of Putin, withdrew from that signing at the time. That was immediately followed by the so-called Euromaidan protests in the famous square in Kiev. And there are issues also of corruption, abuse of power, human rights violations that were fueling those protests, and the introduction of anti-protest laws. So then we saw what played out in 2014 through those Maidan protests, a lot of mobilization of the oppressive arms of the state, and casualties caused by snipers, etc., killing protesters. And this didn't deter Ukrainians at all. They didn't fall victim to all of this pressure. And at the same time, you then started seeing Putin introduce the promotion of separatist agitation in the eastern provinces, Luhansk and Donetsk and Crimea. And that was then followed by the effective invasion by Russia of the Crimea through the so-called Little Green Men, because Putin denied that there were Russian soldiers involved in that, claimed it was all a local takeover of people who wanted to remain part of Russia. And so Russia has remained in control of the Crimea ever since, due through this so-called Little Green Men invasion, but were clearly all Russian military, organized and deployed by Vladimir Putin. So that through this process and the years that have developed since that time, Putin has also experimented with cyber warfare, pressure on Ukraine, affecting their power generation and their economic activity, and hacking commercial infrastructure, etc. So Ukraine has learned a lot over that time with some smart technology experts themselves, and managed to defeat a lot of that cyber warfare vulnerability with assistance, of course, from the West. So less vulnerable to that over time. And then a really key turning point was the 12th of July 2021, when Putin issued his essay, which he entitled On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians. And as I say, effectively, it kind of echoed a Mein Kampf, where he was talking about this ethnic unity, the need for all of these Rus, former connected peoples, to be part of a coherent whole, and the exact same type of ethnic empire focus that Hitler outlined in reuniting the German people of Eastern Europe, etc., known as the Deutsche Volk. And he claimed in his essay, Putin, that this is one people and a single whole. And he referred consistently to the dark forces that had always sought to undermine our unity, and external patrons, all this sort of terminology, who'd misled and exploited Ukraine, and the forced changes of identity, attempts to ethnically cleanse the eastern regions of Russians and Crimea, people who he claimed viewed themselves as Russians, who were being massacred and mistreated, and that labeling Ukraine as being rent with these neo-Nazis who were driving all this, and looking to facilitate a NATO takeover of Ukraine, which Vladimir Putin was absolutely committed and determined to prevent at all costs. So his critical statement here was he was confident that the true sovereignty of Ukraine is possible, but only in partnership with Russia. And then, of course, what we saw was the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. And that came as a massive shock to the world. You'd had previous ambitions of people like President Angela Merkel of Germany to tightly engage with Russia through their contracts on energy, etc., so that they'd be too bound to Europe to engage in a more aggressive military posture and cease to be a military threat to Western Europe. Unfortunately, all of that theorising and actions to try and create that closer ties with Russia and come to accommodations, what looked a lot like the appeasement of the 1930s in many ways, all fell apart with that invasion in February of 2022. So that brings us to the war, and we'll try and unpack that in great detail as we go forward in these programs. There's so much to learn from that. Why didn't Russia succeed in overwhelming Ukraine immediately? How were the Ukrainians able to oppose them? What happened during the course of the war? What are the political and other dynamics that have evolved since that time? Where do we sit now and where do we go from here? We'll broach all of those subjects as we go forward. So thanks for being with me. Hopefully that gives you a little context for how this war occurred and what are the factors we need to understand before we resolve this. So we'll see you again next week, and thanks for being with me here on Frontlines and Faultlines.